In February 2026, military action closed the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping, bringing one of the world's most critical transit routes to a standstill. This map highlights the Strait of Hormuz. Because nearly 20% of the world's seaborne oil supply flows through this specific choke point, the closure instantly severed a vital artery of global energy distribution. In response to the crisis, the U.S. Energy Information Administration modeled the economic fallout in their April 2026 short-term energy outlook. The EIA's modeling shows that the blockade broke the mathematical link between global oil benchmarks. While seaborne crude prices soared, domestic prices in the U.S. remained anchored to local supply. This regional shutdown forces an immediate fragmentation of energy pricing across the globe. This chart shows the Brent crude spot price forecast. The dark blue line models a violent upward trajectory, peaking at $115 per barrel in Q2 2026. That spike represents the cost of physical scarcity as nations scramble for seaborne barrels. But the anomaly appears in this second graph, which plots the spot price spread between global Brent crude and the U.S. domestic benchmark, West Texas Intermediate. The gap between these two typically correlated assets explodes to a massive $15 per barrel. To truly understand how a single geographic choke point causes such extreme price divergence, we have to trace the data backward. We need to look at how a regional physical shut-in ripples outward to isolate local benchmarks and trigger secondary market contagion. Identifying the drivers behind these divergent price lines reveals the specific points where a physically constrained supply chain begins to fail. The origin of the price shock begins with the mechanical reality of the transit backup itself. With shipping routes closed, tankers cannot leave the Persian Gulf. Producing nations rapidly exhaust local storage capacity. Once those onshore tanks are full, operators have no choice but to physically halt extraction at the wellhead. By April 2026, the EIA assessed that Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, and neighboring states were forced to collectively shut in 9.1 million barrels of crude oil production per day. With that massive volume of new production completely offline, global markets are forced to consume existing stored reserves to keep their economies functioning. This chart models implied global oil inventory changes. Notice the massive dark blue bar dropping sharply below zero, representing a severe global inventory draw. Prior to the conflict, inventories were building quickly. This sudden draw completely reverses that baseline. This physical deficit acts as a wedge, prying the global market apart into isolated regional supply zones. Returning to the Brent WTI spread chart, we can see why this massive supply deficit did not impact all crude oil equally. Brent crude relies heavily on open shipping lanes, so it absorbs the full brunt of skyrocketing transportation premiums and physical scarcity. West Texas Intermediate, however, is priced domestically within the United States. Its value is anchored to the internal pipeline and storage grid at Cushing, Oklahoma. This physical isolation provides WTI with geographic buffers that insulate it from the immediate seaborne shock. The first buffer was inventory volume. The U.S. held above-average commercial crude inventories, further bolstered by the government's emergency release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The second buffer was regulatory. A 60-day Jones Act waiver allowed foreign vessels to transport commodities between domestic U.S. ports, smoothing out logistical friction. By utilizing vast domestic storage infrastructure and rapid policy intervention, the U.S. crude benchmark was temporarily immunized from the global seaborne panic. But the effects of a supply shock do not stop at the wellhead. The pressure cascades downstream into the complex world of refined products. This graph compares U.S. retail gasoline and distillate prices. Look closely at the aggressively widening gap. Diesel prices completely separate from historical correlation, peaking at over $5.80 per gallon, a much steeper climb than gasoline or crude oil. This happens because of a structural vulnerability. Global distillate supplies, like diesel fuel, were already extraordinarily tight before the Strait of Hormuz even closed. Europe is highly reliant on trade to meet its diesel demand. Following the 2023 ban on seaborne imports of Russian gas oil, Europe heavily concentrated its reliance on a much smaller set of suppliers located in the Middle East. Contrast that specific geographic vulnerability with the U.S. gasoline market, which maintained average or above-average inventories, keeping refiner and retail margins relatively stable. In a macroeconomic bottleneck, refined products lacking supplier diversity become the first critical points of market failure. The contagion quickly spills from liquid fuels into entirely separate secondary markets, specifically the natural gas grid. The catalyst for this spread was a secondary attack on the Ras Laffan LNG export facility in Qatar on March 18th. The resulting physical damage to 2 liquefaction trains instantly removed a massive 17. These highly favorable pricing economics strongly incentivize the United States to capture the arbitrage opportunity by exporting massive volumes of liquefied natural gas. This chart tracks U.S. LNG gross exports. Notice the dark blue line climbing rapidly, pushing out nearly 18 billion cubic feet per day. These volumes are capped strictly by the physical nameplate capacity of the terminals themselves. A severe disruption at a crude oil choke point forces completely distinct energy sectors to physically rebalance in order to prevent total grid collapse. Reviewing the totality of the EIA's April 2026 data requires us to reevaluate how we model energy shocks. The $15 gap between Brent and WTI marks a transition toward an energy grid defined by physical proximity rather than global connectivity. Primary supply interruptions do not create uniform global energy crises that distribute pain evenly across all nations. Instead, they create a fragmented map. The market splits into geographic winners protected by domestic production and isolated losers starved of seaborne imports. The U.S. navigated the initial crude price shock relatively well because it possessed the domestic buffers, inventory, and policy mechanisms to isolate its internal pricing. At the same time, the U.S. aggressively capitalized on international price premiums by pushing its LNG export terminals to their absolute maximum operational limits. Every extreme data point in the EIA model traces directly back to the physical blockade at the Strait of Hormuz. But the true macroeconomic limitation in this scenario is not just the 9.1 million barrels of energy sitting trapped at the source. The ultimate bottleneck becomes the physical capacity limits of secondary infrastructure. Every alternative pipeline, storage tank, and export terminal races to fill the void until it hits its maximum flow rate. In modern energy architecture, systemic resilience is defined by total routing flexibility rather than the volume of underground reserves.